time-sensitive response to the East Palestine train derailment. I'm Jen Kim Mozaleski, and I'm one of the faculty members here at the PRCHN, and I'm filling in for Dr. Erica Trappel, who could not join us today for some family reasons. And I have a few introductory slides that we go through. So first, if you haven't already, please connect with us on our social, as you can see all on this page here. Just a plug for next month's seminar. We like to introduce these and get folks signed up in advance. So next month in October, we will be featuring Lindsay Lott who is a development coordinator with Birthing Beautiful Babies. And you'll see the link to register here today. I believe Kate's gonna enter that into the chat, so you can just click that link and get signed up for the next month's seminar while you're here. And we like to kind of get a feel for who's in the audience. We've kept these seminars virtual so that it's accessible to many folks. Please add your name and organization in the chat so that we can introduce we can introduce ourselves. And please feel free to type in questions in the chat as we go on today. And last but not least, I will introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Fred Schumacher, who's an associate professor in the Department of Population and Quantitative Health Sciences at Case. He's also a co-leader in the Population and Cancer Prevention Program in the Case Comprehensive Cancer Center. Dr. Schumacher is a genetic epidemiologist whose research interests are in three major areas: deciphering the inherited genetic architecture of complex traits, assessing the shared genetic etiology of complex phenotypes to elucidate the underlying biology, and determining the clinical impact of inherited variation. His primary research focus is on cancer, particularly prostate cancer. He is an international leader in the study of the role of germline genetics in cancer susceptibility and progression. And for more than a decade, he has led large multi-study consortia within and across cancers. And these consortia have enabled the discovery of cancer genetic risk factors, the generalizability of genetic effects among non-European ancestral populations, and the evaluative utility of genetics in cancer risk prediction. We're really excited to have him here with us for our first seminar series of the academic year, as he will be speaking about the Case Western Reserve University and its Healthy Futures research study to help residents affected by the Norfolk Southern trail derailment in East Palestine, Ohio, and understanding the long-term impact of the derailment on their health. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and allow Dr. Schumacher to share his slides. Please take it away.
I'm picking up something, but yes. Can everyone hear me right now?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me? I'm picking up some other noise. I'm not sure. Okay, good. Thank you, Jen, for the introduction. So before you just log off because maybe you heard all the genetic stuff. You know, that is my training. So I guess I'm a trained, genetic epidemiologist, statistical geneticist. I like to do a lot of ones and zeros and sit behind the computer screen. This project has been a journey. It's been a journey because it's really it showed some newer things to me, was where, going across, understanding your lane, but then reaching out to other people within the university and, piggybacking on their expertise and developing a project that we thought was really necessary and responsive to a community in need. And so we're going to talk about a little bit of that process of how we got here. And what we're also going to kind of do is, I was lucky enough to convince Jamie Wallace, who is going to introduce herself in a second, but I just want to introduce her. She's a resident of East Palestine. So this is not just a research funding opportunity project for her. This is every day. This is something that they dealt with since February 3rd. It's really changed their community in the face of that and some of their perspectives. And so she's going to provide that in that viewpoint. And we thought it would be interesting because we're going to look at East Palestine in the surrounding community before, during, and after the train derailment, with the idea of how did the community's perspective, maybe differ from a researcher's perspective, and then where's that convergence at? and how has they kind of come together. So hopefully this will be kind of an interesting talk where we're kind of bounce off of each other and kind of guide you along what we've kind of done here. And I'm just going to say Jamie was, I think I was trying to look it up in my phone. The first time we talked and texted was like late February, early March. So she was one of the first people who reached out after a different contact. So she's been very passionate and involved, obviously, with this being her community. So I'm going to let Jamie Wallace introduce herself real quick. I just saw her. Hopefully, I know she was there. That first presentation of the year. Jamie, did you want to introduce yourself real quick? I see you're on, but muted.
I just got kicked off for a second. My name is Jamie Wallace. I have roots in Cleveland. I actually worked at Cleveland State University for 15 years, and I got my master's in public administration there and my Juris Doctor degree. I'm also a lifelong resident of East Palestine, Ohio, and I have 47 immediate family members that live within the 1 mile zone of the derailment.
So that is, thank you for being here and introducing yourself. And yeah, I mean, that really changes the perspective when, we're an hour and a half away, but you have 47 relatives that are right within the direct area of that. I'm going to start. So this is kind of the outline of what we're going to talk about. We already kind of discussed that. So I'm going to still let Jamie kind of describe, we're going to go back and forth. She's going to describe a little bit of like the East Palestine community. Maybe not everyone's familiar actually of like the location or what kind of town this, what it looks like, the size of it. So this is just some pictures and snapshots. Jamie, do you want to describe a little bit of like East Palestine and what it was like?
Sure. So East Palestine sits about a half an hour south of Youngstown. So like Dr. Schumacher said, it's about an hour and a half away from Cleveland. It's a very small community. I apologize. I got cut off. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
I don't know why my phone has been so weird. But we primarily, a lot of times we depend on our wildlife to eat. So we're kind of what people call backwoods, I guess, a very tight-knit community. If somebody was hurting, whether it was, financially, physically, the community came together and stuck together. That's the part of the reason why I left Cleveland State University. I had wanted kids my entire life and found out at 42 that I was pregnant. I wanted to go back home. Family is really important to us. A lot of us live in multi-generational homes. For example, my stepdad's home has been in his family for 6 generations. Our land is very important to us down here, our heritage, and just
I lost you again there.
I have no clue why it's going in and out. I have full bars.
I'll go to the next. I think that's a great description. So the close knit community, and I think that sets up something to think about later on as a research group. You're coming into an environment where people really know each other. They know not just who you are, but also probably a lot of your siblings, your parents, your children. So then you're like this new face coming in, and I learned from talking with Erica and others about building trust within the community. And so some of this journey has kind of been part of that. So from my perspective, what we kind of saw coming in was really just, the numbers part, right? So this is something that, we pulled from the Ohio Census data, looking at, comparing some of these 4 counties. And I'm kind of just showing these because these are the 4 counties we ended up recruiting from. But this is including both Columbiana and Mahoney in Ohio. And Columbiana is where East Palestine resides. So it's that whole county is about over 100,000 individuals. And then with Mahoning, which includes Youngstown, you're approaching over close to 350,000. And then with Beaver in Lawrence, Pennsylvania, it's about another 250,000. You can see the demographics, the aging distribution is pretty much consistent across all of those, with about 40% of individuals being between those working years of 18 to 65. It's predominantly white, self-reported white across each of the counties, except for Mahoning, where some diversity there with about 16% of Black or African-American population. The rest of the demographics are pretty consistent. You may notice median household income is slightly higher within Beaver County. That's because a couple of different plants and manufacturing and factories down there in that area. And then looking at the other distributions with individuals in poverty, or looking at household internets, very similar in high numbers there. So from a cancer's perspective, which I think Jin described, that's where I've always kind of felt my interest was, or it still is, and just how I would look at something. So if you look at the rates across Ohio, the incidence rates for Ohio and Pennsylvania for the last 10 years have been decreasing. They're very, very similar, just the axes aren't exactly the same. But then you can look at the county distributions, the numbers here for overall cancer statistics for both Ohio and Pennsylvania. And Mahoning County is right over here, and Columbiana is right below that. And this is where East Palestine is. And then you have on the other side for Pennsylvania, Beaver County, or Lawrence County, and then Beaver County. And so you can see the rates aren't that much different than the rest of the state. Now, of course, when you look a little bit more specific and get into some of the details, you'll notice that there are some differences. And this is just, from my background, where I'm always kind of looking at, is there a place where incidence or mortality may differ, something that, that would be an interest to go down and think about how we can intervene and help the community, engage with the community. Some of the differences here are a little bit within colorectal cancer incidence, a little bit slightly higher, but not, it wasn't statistically significant, and a little bit higher within cervical cancer. And you can see though, but for prostate cancer, it's extremely, it's actually statistically different from Ohio, it's lower, and about the same for lung cancer and breast. And just looking at like some of the, from the Ohio Department of Health, some other statistics that are kind of important, because we've been trying to work with the Ohio Department of Health in Columbiana County, and they've had a cancer registry program for the last 30 to 40 years, which is pretty significant when it comes to thinking about resources within the area, understand what the baseline disease rates were prior to the train derailment, and then to think about how that's going to be, how that may change as time goes on. They also have some health clinical utility with like potential blood draws. And so here you can just kind of see by late stage disease, slightly higher for cervical cancer would probably be the biggest thing, where screening is a little bit lower than the rest of the state or in the national levels. But for colorectal and mammogram, it's all it's very well, compatible with the other state registries. The other thing I think about this is, before we get to the train derailment, and I'll switch back to Jamie, is NCI currently sponsors about 41 different cancer cohorts across the world. And if you look at the representation of those cohorts, there's very few that is capturing this area of the country, where you're looking at kind of rural Ohio, state across Pennsylvania. So there's definitely a need here. I know All of Us, which is a larger cancer cohort study, or a larger cohort study, may include part of this area, but currently it's not, it's very underrepresented. So this is something that we've kind of felt, that I felt as an interest, to develop a baseline cohort to think about overall health effects given that environment. So now I'm going to move to February 3rd, which I think if you're not familiar with this date, it's pretty significant to Jamie. So I'm going to pass it over to Jamie to kind of explain like how she, what happened on that day, and then we can talk about the after part.
Well, on February 3rd for my family, it wasn't a typical night. Actually, my husband's best friend had come in from Cleveland. So I was watching his friend's child, and they were out having a couple of drinks. I had my daughter. Very much, like I said, a close-knit community. The first thing I heard were sirens. When we hear sirens in East Palestine, we jump up and look out the window because it's going to somebody's house that you know. The next thing I got was a phone call from my mother saying that there was a derailment. I called my husband. Little known fact about the derailment site, it derailed right at our local pub, the only bar that we have in town, and he was there having a drink. I called him and he said, oh, it's a little fire. Firefighters are running away from the fire. It must be contained. Within 5 minutes, he called me back and he said, this is bad. I'm on my way home. The gas station that was right there at ground zero, he thought it was going to explode. Once he got home, I learned of the evacuation from my mother. She called and said, they're evacuating everyone within the 1 mile zone. I instantly grabbed my child, grabbed change of clothes for her, and we headed out the door and didn't even know where we were going to go or what we were going to do that night.
And that's, I mean, it's pretty impactful to think about, like, how quickly that went from a peaceful night of maybe a visitor coming in and you're just thinking of having a long weekend with some house guests and then transitioning to an evacuation. And I think this is important as we think about future studies because of the anxiety. And I talked to Jamie about this in her own children, you know, the stress and anxiety that may be spreading across the community and things that they're picking up that is something that we want to consider. For the rest of like the part of the train derailment, if you're not familiar with it, this was a train by Norfolk Southern. I think they're still kind of trying to confirm some of the causes behind it, but there was it seems like some mechanical and maybe human error, and maybe there's others who have more into that. But basically, one of the things was a couple of the cars, and I believe it was like 12 to 13 cars that spilled had some chemicals inside, including vinyl chloride, which is probably the predominant one. And from what it seems like from the conversations like that we've heard and had, is that the vinyl chloride was leaking. There was some concern about if it was going to continue to leak out and how they were going to capture that. So one of the things they decided to do was to make a controlled burn. They opened up the valves for some of the vinyl chloride to go into a ditch near the train tracks, which is, as Jamie described, it was literally I haven't been at the actual train site because you're not allowed into that. It's quarantined off. But if you can see how close it is to houses. So this gutter, this ditch area was right behind some people's homes. Then they did a controlled burn to help kind of leave what they thought was to get rid of the chemical from filtering into the soil, and then bring people back after the fact. So then kind of moving to after the train derailment, I think Jamie, where I've met her is because she's been very involved with some community action plans, action groups. Also been involved with a number of politicians, and then also dealing with the EPA. So kind of wanted to have her kind of describe some of her interactions with the community and how those are coming together. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we started the Healthy Futures Research Project and the grant that we wanted to put forward. So Jamie, if you want to talk a little bit about like some of your interactions with the community groups and the political groups.
Sure. I just wanted to clarify something. The EPA has now admitted that it was an illegal open burn per their own guidelines. So people called it a controlled burn. It was not a controlled burn. And the train had been on fire for at least 30 miles and was being reported to local police departments along that entire route. So, I'll talk about EPA first. My first home. The EPA says it's fine. It must be fine. My husband said we absolutely were not going home. As soon as I pulled in my driveway, I was going back to get some medication. We didn't think to grab medication when we were running out of our house. So as soon as I pulled in my driveway, I started coughing. My lungs started burning. I apologize once again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
I'm sorry. So as soon as I pulled in that driveway, I knew something wasn't. When I felt that way and I looked over and saw chemicals free flowing down my creek, that is literally 5 steps from my front door, I knew that things were not okay. I knew that something more was going on. They lifted the evacuation just 2 days after they did this open burn. Only testing that they were doing was some in-home air testing with a handheld monitor, which the EPA has since admitted could not pick up uh, anything but emergency levels. It was not able to test that low. And for some of the chemicals, it did not test at all. I was asking the toxicologist when they came to do my air test, what's in the creeks? Well, we tested it, but we don't really know yet. Have you tested the soil? We don't think the soil needs tested. In fact, I was asking them what all chemicals were on the train. We haven't even seen a manifest yet. My personal story, they saw some creek water running down my basement wall. This was CTEH hired by Norfolk Southern. The next day, Norfolk Southern. But at that point, we chose not to keep our mouth shut, to go tell everybody at our town hall what was going on. So when the EPA broke my level of trust to the point of my daughter's life, you know, I don't know how they'll ever get that back. I do meet with them probably at least a couple times a month, but they we keep catching them in lies. They're backtracking. As far as community actions, some of the stuff we've done is we have held community press conferences. We also started the Unity Council for the East Palestine train derailment. I am the president of that and also the founder. I actually started that based on my work at Cleveland State University as the president of SEIU 1199 Union. I kind of saw that there were so many different parts of this, from human health symptoms to the animals, domesticated and wildlife, to the stress and anxiety, the post-traumatic stress. You had to deal with the government, Norfolk Southern, watching just everybody. So we formed this Unity Council, and then we have executive subcommittees. So certain people work on certain parts of it. We have some people just work on the politics of it, some the human health aspects of it, some people just doing research, media. So, those are just a couple of the actions that we have taken. We also have disrupted at the State House. We could not get our legislators to meet with us. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Community. Community is saying everything's fine, and half is saying that it's not. Norfolk Southern is dumping money at our community as a whole, putting in a $25 million park renovation, things of that nature. We also went to Capitol Hill and met with 10 different legislators to push them to get Biden to sign off on the declaration, the state of emergency. We did have Sherrod Brown, and we still have some of those letters coming in. So that's just some of the things that we've done, and a lot of what we call citizen science.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is important because these were some of the groups we've met with these groups to help kind of get the word out about our study, to understand, to explain what we're doing, and also to collaborate with other researchers, because you can imagine we weren't the only group that was thinking about how we could be think about the science as well as engaging with the community. There was people from Purdue, as well as from Kentucky and another of our institutions, and it was really trying to also to think about how we could work with them so that we didn't have the same questions being asked multiple times. But this really started with, I think Darcy and some others, Tim and Maeve McMurdo, who had a working group on how we could respond to East Palestine. And so, we kind of came together to think, what would be a plan to think about, a response from not just the Cancer Center, but from the case community as well, and bring some of our expertise down and provide some guidance on maybe, with what the long-term health effects could be. So one of the first things that we looked at was there's this NIEHS is mostly the driver behind this, which is one of the institutes for environmental health. Is they had this R21 program, which a lot of us are familiar with, but they had this special one where they call it time sensitive. And the idea behind the time sensitive is that that they review these pretty quickly. Now, I think quickly is definitely relative term, because in NIH's world, we submitted this grant in April 3rd with merit review at the end of May. We were supposed to have the council review in August, which would have meant funding at the earliest in November, so 7 months. So just for Jamie, this is the major funders of a lot of science is the National Institutes of Health, and they're not the fastest moving type of organization, and this is considered their fastest, which is 7 months. This has recently been pushed. They've just had a conversation with the program officer that they're not going to have the council review until October. Hopefully with still a November funding date, although I'm sure it'll be back funded. So we'll probably be, spending some funds behind. But we're still looking at 7 to 9 months before we actually know about this. And this is kind of considered the rapid response for any kind of environmental accident or tragedy that happens. The first thing that when we put this together, when I was thinking about this, was obviously this was a community that I looked at from like outside, but I didn't have a sense of what it was like. So we really wanted to make sure that we were going to have a focus on building that community education and research capacity. I grew up I didn't grow up, but I was, my relatives, I was from Tuscarawas County, which is just west of here. So I had a sense of like, it's a very close knit community. You just don't kind of fly in and, collect blood samples and move on. It's really about engaging and building up some of that trust. So we wanted to make sure that we were going to have a community action board that would help us with this. So this is something that we put in the grant. There's like 5 residents. I think we've had conversations now where we'd like to extend this to, at least 6 to 8 residents. Then the second aim was really to think about what was the science that we were going to look at. So as Jamie mentioned, there was a lot of work that's been done from the EPA. Now, whether that's been very productive or not, is definitely debatable. But the EPA looks at air, water, and soil. And those are very important things in this community, because I think maybe around the estimates I've seen is like 90% of their economic livelihoods are based on farming, agricultural, something related to the land. And even Jamie related to that earlier about how, I think it was the backwoods is the idea that, you're living off that land. So the EPA kind of covers that. But what the EPA doesn't really cover is human health. So we wanted to think about what were some long-term effects that might be, not observed in the acute phase, but more in the chronic phase of exposure. And then the aim 3 was really to think about what are some of the things that we're missing. So obviously this grant right now didn't include anything about mental stress or anxiety. It doesn't include children at this point. So this was kind of then aim 3 was to have a post-disaster communication with the community and get a sense of, are we missing some things, and what kind of other research could we bring in to help alleviate concerns or mitigate or understand some of those risks. Oops. And then just a diagram of that is listed here for the way we're going to kind of move forward. So we were thinking about around 200 people that would be sampled for the genomic toxicity. And I'll talk a little bit about that just to give people a sense of what this is actually doing and why we thought it was important. And then looking at aim 3, we're thinking around 40 to 50 people, and then the community board somewhere between probably 6 to 8 people. So one of the first things I've learned from people and thought this was a valuable lesson was you probably don't want to use a figure like this in the community. Maybe for the grant purposes, it's okay. And the problem with the community level is what if you're on the very outside of this circle? If you're on the outside of that circle, then, are you actually any different than the person who's just across that line? Now, I know from like the science perspective, we have to have some sort of boundaries or cutoff. But when you start presenting this to a community, then you start drawing concerns about where that limit is. Is it 40 miles out? But then what if I live 40.1 miles? Am I at any less risk than the person at 39.9? And so it still draws some concerns. So what we did decide to do was, instead of just thinking of it as a concentric circles around and where we were going to look at, where the train derailment might be here in the center, we decided to recruit across the 4 counties. And so this, Columbiana County is where East Palestine is, and then north is Mahoning, and then obviously the 2 that are adjacent in Pennsylvania. So this is a multi-state idea and study that we wanted to create this long-term follow-up study to look at. So what do I mean by DNA somatic mutation rates? Just for this is different than germline. So germline is something that mom and dad passed on to you. Somatic mutation rates you can think about as something that you acquire over a lifetime. So tissue damage that occurs that then becomes like a point mutation, and then that can lead to certain diseases. There's been a number of these observed from UV radiation or UV photon light that can cause damage to DNA, particularly in the skin, and cause maybe somatic mutations that then can lead to skin cancer. There's also been a number of studies in what people have called DNA adducts, which is just where chemicals actually bind to certain components of the DNA and cause damage and lead to replication problems. And so these are a little bit more rare. They're not as well known. We do know a few chemicals that are particularly driven into the DNA adducts, as well as some even viruses. But it's hard to measure these, at least consistently. And that's something that was important, because when I was thinking about which way for the science, it was probably between these 2. And really the DNA adducts is probably the one that's more well vetted. This is a study out of Minnesota with Steve Heck, who's looked at smoking and how some of the toxicities from smoking is actually related to DNA adduct damage. But it isn't as clear for, like, if you don't know the chemical or the exact part of the DNA it's binding to, where do you actually measure? So the interesting thing with somatic mutations is that with sequencing technology dropping in price, we could actually think about sequencing somebody and comparing their mutation profile to a reference database. And that reference database then can provide you with, like, where somebody is on their current level of mutation rate, and then you can measure them prospectively to see if longitudinal changes occur. And this is really something that I was reviewing a paper for PANS prior to this, right? About a year before, maybe a little bit longer, of the train derailment. And this is where it piqued my interest. And part of this is really where they looked at individuals, young kids, I think from 5 to 13, who were undergoing chemotherapy for leukemia. And when you looked at individuals who were undergoing chemotherapy here in the yellow dots versus those in the blue dots, and you measured their mutation rate after the chemotherapy, you saw a marked difference. So their mutation frequency, the burden was much higher among those who were undergoing chemotherapy versus those who were not. And then when you looked at it by platinum-based drugs versus non-platinum-based drugs, which are commonly used for leukemia, you could see that there was actually increases for both, but it wasn't significantly different. So it was kind of universal. So it was kind of saying that you were seeing some more damage within platinum. And granted, this is a small study, but you see some differences in platinum, but you also see it in the non-platinum-based drugs. The other part of this figure to look at is just where those mutations were occurring. So a lot of these were from point mutations from CDT, which can be a little bit more alarming when it thinks about for cancer progression. And then you also saw a mutation rate that slightly differed or correlated with age. So a little bit higher, not as easy to see that, but with overall age of the individuals biologically. Now, the good thing is with mutation rates is the somatic mutation rates is the body might get exposed to something like UV light or a chemotherapy, or even something like vinyl chloride, and the body will eventually heal itself. So it'll offset that damage. And so you can see that kind of probably just focusing here on panels A and C. Patients who went up and had a higher mutation rate, when you measured that sample a little bit later, and I think they did it 6 months later, you actually seen it come back down, or sorry, 2 years later, up to 2 years later. And so it does come back down, but it doesn't come back down to what it was in baseline. And the other thing to notice about that to me is that it differs by age. So the younger you are, the more likely you can get it closer to that baseline mutation rate, versus if you are a little bit older, it stays elevated. It doesn't quite make up, which makes sense because the body, if you, I don't want to simplify it, but if you think of like an iPhone and you added, you first get that out of the box, it works perfectly. But then by the time you have 50 apps on it, it seems to slow down and you're just kind of gumming up the works. And it's just the same thing with aging. As you age, the systems that are in place to help repair this damage begins to offset and not work and function as well as they could. So this is one of the reasons why why I thought starting with this baseline somatic mutation rate might be important. The other thing is that it was easy to collect compared to some things. We're not getting tissues here. We're looking at either just saliva or blood, so we can collect the DNA pretty simply. It's a little bit closer to human health impact, so it's not thinking of something long-term that's further out, like say vinyl chloride levels, because that vinyl chloride levels, yes, could be important for a lot of acute phases, but then they're going to get very hard to measure across time as they begin to dilute out. And they get actually, I think when you measure vinyl chloride, or at least some of the downstream intermediates, it takes a large amount of sample to do that, particularly like maybe like 30 to 40 milliliters of blood. The other thing is that the cost is decreasing. And then the part that we felt that was the most like innovative of this approach was that the somatic mutation rate is not specific to a chemical. So I'm not measuring vinyl chloride, where then you have to, there could be some other chemicals or chemical mixtures that could be more important than just vinyl chloride. Jamie mentioned that it wasn't a controlled burn, but it was an illegal combustible burn. But that combustion can cause problems when you're trying to measure a chemical assay, because then you have to know exactly what you're trying to measure, where this is like looking at the damage that was caused by some sort of chemical exposure. Now, the problem with that non-specificity is you don't always know if it was there prior to the exposure or not. So that's why when we were sampling, we were trying to get people and recruit them that were close to the impact or maybe had high symptoms versus people who lived much further away, so that kind of could serve as a baseline. The other option that we've been looking into is applying to NHANES, who did a focused recruitment in Mahoney County around 2018. And so they have some blood samples collected and stored on individuals back in 2018 that could serve as also kind of somewhat of a baseline. So the next part I was just going to think about was, we've talked about how the events before in East Palestine, the community during it, and the community a little bit afterwards, and then how the research kind of came together. So during this time, we were kind of on different paths, but then, Jamie and I and some others began to cross as we were engaging in developing these ideas. We're still waiting on some of the funding. So the R21 that we submitted was scored. The impact factor was like a 29, so it's still in the fundable range. That's why we're still waiting for the council to decide, and hopefully know by October. But it's definitely something that that we're hoping that will be funded. But in the meantime, we had felt that it was very important for us to get down into the community, because 9 months later, if that was the earliest that the R21 was going to be funded, by that point in time, a lot of things have changed. People could have moved out of the community. People may have, moved away further from the exposure zone, or maybe some people weren't as, wasn't as concerned. But either or, we wanted to make sure we were collecting baseline samples so that we had a place to start from. So this is where we started then some of the community engagement. And I don't know, Jamie, if you want to talk about some of the other studies that have been involved in some of the social media work that you guys have done, and then I could talk a little bit about some of the recruitment that we've been doing down there.
Sure. Some of the independent scientists that we are working with is water specialist, Dr. Welton from Purdue. We are also working with Scott Smith from Integrated Technologies. As far as health studies, we have Dr. Haynes, who is funded by NIH. She is doing a study on blood and saliva. They are looking for dioxin. We also have Dr. Golam. She is from California, and she was credited for finding the pathway to exposure between the burn pits in Iraq and the war veterans. We have Dr. Lynn Spearing, who is doing a study. It was focused more on the response and what should have done versus what has not been done. As far as social media, I mean, it's been our main source of information and our main source of communicating with the community. We've also been doing canvassing because we do have an elderly population. Our local government stopped us from canvassing back in April, using a local ordinance for peddlers and vendors, and wanted us to pay like a $400 fee to go door to door and ask people if they needed independent testing, if they needed air monitors or air filters. We are now allowed as of the 24th of August to canvass again. So we are going to be pushing out information on these studies. As Dr. Schumacher said, our community is not real receptive to outsiders in general, and even more so now. So I feel like by having community members walk around and talk positively about, these studies and pushing them out actually is a better method than it coming always directly from the researchers. And just to hit on that, what you were talking about, that zone and how, you said use that for research. One of the issues we had was initially they had evacuated us within a 1 mile zone. And that was only set up as a perimeter in which the shrapnel would have flown if one of those tankers exploded. But Norfolk Southern has been using that as a basement for temporary relocation, for reimbursement, when in fact these chemicals have been found as far as 5 miles out in the indoor air. And we have had our own vice president of Unity Council just get reimbursed after 7 months. She was lucky enough to have Wayne State University. There's another one helping us. They were one of the only ones that were offering testing in Pennsylvania. So she had her indoor air filter tested very early on, and they found hexyl acrylate. I'm sure I just really screwed that up. So yeah, so we have been, working on this nonstop and just pushing it out there, trying to, show people that it wasn't just East Palestine that was impacted. And that's why on our Unity Council, we made sure we had representatives from all of the impacted areas. Our streams run straight downhill to Negley, which is an unincorporated area, and they all have wells. The Plume, we live right on the state line. Actually, the bar I was telling you about that my husband was out at, it's called the state line because it literally sits on the state line. And this derailment happened within feet of the Pennsylvania state line.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like, there's no borders when it comes to the exposures. But then there are the political borders and the state borders that sometimes doesn't always make that easy to think about. Ohio, and this is even just one of those differences, ran an ACE survey, and I think they closed at the end of March 31st. They have reported some of the results of symptoms. So ACE is a chemical exposure, chemical exposure survey that people will do to get a sense of what was the impact. And these are just some responses that they publish for first responders and within the community of Columbiana County. Pennsylvania didn't have quite the results available, so it wasn't as easy. But the reason I kind of show these is that, there was some symptoms that were definitely from first responders to the community. 75% for like the headaches and down to like 15% for hoarseness around first responders. But the important part was getting some of this baseline data from the beginning, which hasn't always been easy. So we've had a difficult time getting some of the IRBs approved for this, partly because the ODH is way behind and understaffed for IRB, which I think, a few people in this call might be able to attest to. So that's been a little bit of a complication. The good thing is we have worked with several of the researchers that Jamie mentioned, so particularly Aaron Haynes out of Kentucky and Dr. Sterling out of University of Illinois in Chicago, and we've spoken to a few of the others. So the idea was that we were trying to use similar surveys. So one of the surveys that we're actually using is very similar to Dr. Haynes and also to the ACE survey, so that we had compatibility across and people weren't necessarily being inundated with the same questions. The other thing that we wanted to do to engage the community right away was to use the summer events that were happening. So this, we thought, with Jamie's presence on social media and some other things that we are engaging with, but we also wanted to be down into the community. So prior to the summer, or across the early part of the summer, I was going to the weekly EPA meetings that were being presented in East Palestine. It was more just to sit back and kind of listen to what was being said from both the residents and also from the EPA, and not really, talking about any of the science, but just getting a sense of what was happening at the ground. And then that kind of made us think, well, you had a lot of differences of opinions. We were trying to think about, the funding wasn't going to come into place until like later into November. We wanted to see if we could recruit people earlier on. One of the things that we started thinking about of how, where do a lot of people engage at is the county fairs, which typically take place at the end of the summer. If you think back, especially in agricultural societies, like that was like when the harvest and everything was coming in. So luckily we were able to get some pilot funding to be able to do this. And this is just, we went to three different fairs. One, the Columbiana County Fair, the Lawrence County Fair, and then Hookstown Fair in Beaver County. And we spent a total of about 13 days. So about 4 days across each of those that, accumulated into about 52 to 60 hours. We had probably 1 to 2, maybe 3 volunteers there each day. So this is, someone, if you haven't recognized, this is Anthony Orsino, who was a huge help. And I think this was at the Lawrence County Fair. I'll be honest, a lot of the barns and stuff start looking the same after you went to 4 fairs within like 3 weeks time. But this is just kind of the booth that we set up. We had a banner displaying the name. We had a lot of things through QR codes, because people are walking by, just to either pass out a pamphlet or to give them a business card so they could QR code later. Some people stopped and engaged. A nice thing was to have lollipops available, not because everyone loves lollipops, but you go to the fair, you go with your family. And it was a great way for the kids to get distracted and kind of search through the bowl to find a lollipops, and for you to help them, talk to the parents as they stopped waiting for their child to pick out their favorite flavor. So it was a good way to kind of slow down the movement as people were moving from one vendor to another, and to at least kind of hand them off a pamphlet. And that pamphlet that we handed was something that looked like this, a very brief description of what we were doing, with some contact information from the emails to the website, as well as the URL code. And then we also had business cards that had pretty much just the UR code, or the QR code, as well as some contact information. So just very quickly, I know we're getting there on time, but I want to get to the questions, is, we've consented almost 200 people, or at least about 200 people have applied to be consented. Some weren't eligible. So the eligibility was to be 18 or older, as well as living in one of those 4 counties. We've had 121 individuals complete the survey. You can see the breakdown here, which is very similar to the breakdown that I showed earlier for Columbiana County. It's primarily white. You can look at the smoking status, 50% of never, current being around 26%. You can see that the number of households of the 121 people we had, almost half of them, slightly half of them had children in the household that are school aged. We think this is important to understand so that for developing and extending more studies. The one thing you see here is the majority of the participants are female. I've learned that it's not easy to engage males. A lot of them would walk away when you're talking to a couple, but the wife or the spouse would stay back. So that's just one thing that we've noticed on our recruitment. Where these reside, you can see that the majority is Columbiana County, and this is for people who attempted, so some of these aren't actually in the study, but the majority were coming out of Columbiana County, and then Beaver and Lawrence. Those are the 3 that we had presence at. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get into the Canfield Fair, which is the Mahoney County State Fair. It's a much larger fair, and they required you to have a vendor agreement by early February before the fair, and that we weren't even in existence at that point in time. Just to give it a little bit of sense of like maybe the proximity. So we do have the addresses, and we can map those to see where they were from the train derailment. But you can see that within that 1 mile, there was 30 people who were asked to evacuate, compared to over 80 that were not. And then for those who did evacuate, where did they go? You can see that some, the stress that was put onto them from this, from finding another place to live, whether it was a relative's home, but as Jamie said, 40 plus of her members lived in the same area, versus a hotel, which is going to be a financial strain. Just how did people think about their long-term exposure? Were they at all concerned? You can see this from varying from drinking water to health itself. A majority of this, even though the EPA was covering a lot of the water, air, and soil, at least they were testing it to some level. There wasn't a lot for long-term health, but there's a lot of concerns there. So, ranging from anywhere from moderately and above was almost 75%. So this was something that we felt that, our study was helping kind of put this into perspective and be able to provide an outlet. I'll save the future directions as we get to the discussion. I just want to make sure we acknowledge first to East Palestine residents in the community. So Jamie, Zusa was one of the initial contacts, who I think put us in contact with Jamie, and then there's been multiple others. The Healthy Research Team. So you can see so far we don't have any of the genetic data, but that's about to come. We're going to get sample kits out soon. So a lot of this, is expertise from people like Erica Trappel, Maura, Catherine, Anthony Orsino, Christy Miskiven, who's helped us on figuring out how do we actually go and collect these. And then Maeve McCurdo, thinking about some new studies on how for lung exposure. And then Maura McCall is a postdoc / early investigator researcher who lives actually in the area. She works at the nursing school here, and she was one of the major motivators to have us really think about trying to get down to this area and do something. And then there's a number of other people here, from the Cancer Center to the communications group. And then some funding that we received from the Cancer Center, as well as the CTSA, and then also from Michael Oakes' office for research and technology management. And then we're hoping on the NIH chat. So I wanted to leave some time for some conversation. I didn't leave as much as I was hoping, but there we go. So any comments and questions to either myself or to Jamie?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Fred and Jamie. I see some comments in the chat. And maybe I'll invite, Tim Chitelski to share the comments and questions you had.
Cool. I wanted to say thanks as well. This is great to see this getting started. Shannon and I and some other folks are starting to compile all the publicly available environmental measurements. And as you both noted, it's voluminous data, but it's imperfect and it's incomplete. And in many cases, we don't even know what we should be measuring. Are you aware of any folks that you've talked to, like in your dealings, perhaps from a university level, UK or Purdue, that might be looking at mass spec for the different matrices to sort of figure out what might be there that we're not suspecting?
So that's a great question, Tim. So I skipped over that slide from the DNA side. That is where I think the DNA addex is where I really want to go, is the mass spec with the sequencing, because then you're picking up chemicals that you don't know that is there. Where I said mass spec DNA addex are usually very focused. The other one for the environmental samples, which I think you're more thinking about, I think there's been some work that Jamie suggested from Wayne State University, who has a really strong environmental program. I don't know that group as well from this end. I know some other people because we have a T32 with them. But we're looking, I can try to find out a little bit more of that. But I at one point was contacting them about mass spec for DNA, and they didn't do that, but they did do mass spec for chemicals. So I got to see if they're actually doing that. I don't know if Jamie knows like what assay they're doing exactly, but that would be one thought.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't clarify. Not the Malditoff mass spec, but yeah, a chemical screen. But thank you. I have other questions, but we'll talk later. Cool stuff.
I just wanted to say something real quick about the results that you showed in regards to the different symptoms. There was only I think 300 people that responded. Part of the issue was that the CDC came in to go door to door to pass out these surveys and to get people to take it, and they got sick. Almost the same percentage of their group out of the 14, 7 got sick. And that's what we're seeing is about 50% illness in the community. That was not reported to us for about 2 months. The CDC never came back until we demanded it. They recently came back about a month ago and told us almost verbatim, we know you all have vinyl chloride in your systems. We don't know what to do about that, but we can treat the cancers it causes. So, that was kind of a smack in the face. And, our point is with these medical studies is the CDC sent in these, I call them the dog and pony show clinics very early on. They weren't even taking your blood pressure. They should have started doing baseline testing on us then, because if I'm going to die of cancer in 10 years and my daughter has to watch me go through that, at least we could save another community from going through what we have had to go through.
Hopefully that's not going to happen, for a lot of reasons. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to follow up on that powerful of a statement. But one of the things I think is that I found frustrating is that you have a time-sensitive matter here. It's not just EP. There's been ones we've recently seen from Maui to, if you think about what happened in the Gulf Coast with the oil leakage and everything. And it takes 9 to 10 months to even get the grant funded. And that's considered like an activated response. Like, I just don't understand how you think of that as being, to Jamie's point, like samples should have been collected at ground zero as soon as possible, not waiting until, if we're doing it as fast as we can, and I think Erin's a little bit ahead of us out of Kentucky, but she's only measured a little bit in July. So it still took, up to 4 months before that was happening. I don't know how else to, unless you just got a pot of money sitting around, I don't know how you do this. We've been operating this on a shoestring with, Anthony and Catherine driving down to state fairs and eating fried dough. But they didn't eat fried dough, but I mean, it's been very hard to get this going. Even with some of the pilot funding, just because, there's just not a lot of available funds out there for these things.
Any other questions for the speaker? I'll ask one last question, if not. Fred, you mentioned the long-term health effects. So what would be the ideal follow-up time for this community and the long-term health effects?
So I think from that study, some of this is still pretty innovative and novel, but that study showed around a 2 to 3 year period where then the changes started of the somatic mutation rate. So I think, we'd like to have a follow-up for, at least another prospective sampling at 2 to 3 years. But long-term follow-up, I mean, I really think we need, to engage this area for over a decade. And that's where long-term funding, now for that kind of funding, you can plan a little bit more, and that delay can be a little bit understandable, but we still missed out on a lot of the baseline samples. So, we can never get those back. And then there's also I think the other one that, talking with Lynn and others is children. We haven't done a lot here in this area. I intentionally not included them because of IRB delays. I really wanted to get this study rolling as fast as possible. And I knew that if I put in a population like children like that, that could have caused a slowdown. So, we intentionally kind of stayed away from that. But now we need to go back and, but until you get people engaged, and hopefully we get some emails from this, and some I know I talked to Lynn, but if others, we can start figuring out some ways to get down there.
Thank you so much, both Jamie and Fred, for just spending this time with us and teaching us about so many of these different aspects and drawing attention to, the grant timelines and the administrative delays. And we are grateful that you were here to share this information with us, and all our fingers are crossed for the funding to come through. So with that, we'll conclude our September seminar. I invite you, for those who are able, to turn on your camera for a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us today. And for this wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you guys for having me and listening. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you, Jamie, for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.